If you're an urbanist, it's kind of depressing often, right? You look around and you see a lot of ideas that were thought up a generation ago continuing to punish the inhabitants of cities today. I feel like by actually understanding people and validating behavior, validating human nature, our biological bodies, and saying, we're not the problem. We don't need to actually change the human body to fit last century's planning ideas. We need to observe and see really clearly who we are as people. Articulating that, I feel like, is the only hope of having our habitat match who we really are.
Welcome to the Work for Humans podcast. This is Dart Lindsley. Earlier this year, I had Alice Catter, founder of the Out of Office Network, on the show. Alice introduced me to Gehl, an urban design research consultancy that uses empirical analysis to design for social behavior and meaningful change. Gehl's work and research around social infrastructure reimagines workplaces as engines of public life that can become more responsive and more humane to foster the lives we want. In this episode, I'm lucky enough to be joined by Alice, once more, alongside Blaine Merker, partner, director, and head of climate action at Gehl. Blaine leads the company's private sector work focused on helping companies to be good urban citizens and adopt community-centered design practices. During his career, he's led public and institutional portfolios, taught at the University of California, Berkeley, and led a landscape architectural practice. Prior to Gehl, Blaine was partner and founder of Rebar Art and Design Studio, which combines art, design, and activism in the urban environment. In this episode, Blaine, Alice, and I discuss the origin and mission of Gehl, in-between spaces and why companies should invest in them, and shaping behavior through empirical evidence. We also talk about prioritizing people over buildings in architecture, designing for serendipity, connection and collaboration, integrating ecology into corporate landscapes, as well as other topics. If you enjoy this episode's insights today, don't forget to subscribe to Work for Humans to show your support. And now, I'm very excited to present my discussion with Alice Catter and Blaine Merker. Blaine Merker and Alice Catter, welcome to Work for Humans.
Thanks for having us.
Hello.
So I have both of you here for two reasons, which will become clear to listeners in a second. But I want to start by saying that podcasters don't get to go on many field trips. But I got to go on a field trip to look at a space that was created by the architecture company Gehl, which Blaine is a part of. And so today's show is very much about spaces. And it's very much about how spaces affect the experience of work. It's about how spaces affect the experience of everything. And so I want to start first by saying, Alice, why did you introduce me to Gehl and then ultimately to Blaine?
I had a conversation with you, Dart, a couple of months ago, and I think we briefly spoke about the Q Collective as well. And I got introduced to Gehl through the Q Collective, through having worked with the Q Collective, where I did some community programs for the people within the collective to feel more connected, inspired, and learn from each other. And Gehl is part of the Q Collective. And so once I got to know more about Gehl, I really got fascinated by all the work and the research that they've been doing, especially around infrastructure, social infrastructure, and especially around reimagining the workplace and the spaces around work more as part of life, or I think as Gehl calls it, as engines of public life. Because we've been talking about the impact of work and the, I think, new infrastructure that are needed, the new spaces, the new tools that are needed for work as well. And I think especially as we have been also talking about the paradigm shift that is happening right now, where for modern workers, life is more central rather than just work. Being in the center of everything, it also means that we have new desires in our work and lifestyles. And so I've been really interested in how space and environments need to be shifted in the way that it fits how workplace or what role work plays in our lives. And I thought, obviously, Gehl is the perfect company to talk to about this. So this is how this whole conversation started.
Thank you. And Blaine, can you tell us, first of all, what Gehl is all about, what its mission is, and then what your role is in relation to their projects?
It's great to be in conversation with you too. Gehl is a practice of observation linked with design. So what Gehl does is we try to quantify through watching, through other ways of collecting data, which I can talk about, how people move about in space, how they posture their bodies, what they do, and how they feel, and what the relationship of that is to the design of the space. And to try to shape behavior sometimes, then through that evidence-based understanding, and also maybe how to be somewhat humble as designers and to bring a evidence-based humility to the design profession. Because I think the central belief in Gehl's practice is that what people do is always right. How people choose to inhabit a city or a plaza or a workplace is essentially driven by instincts and biology and emotion and state of mind that are tens of thousands of years in the making. And there's a wisdom in that. And I think we believe that by using the tools of social science to understand how people actually behave, not how we might wish they behave as designers, we can make spaces and cities, workplaces more responsive, more humane, and better able to foster the kinds of relationships and life that we want. So that's the practice in a nutshell.
It's very related to a comment. In an interview several years ago, I had Jeremy Neuner on the show, and he's one of the creators of the first co-working spaces. And he then went on to work for the parts of companies that build buildings. And he said that the biggest problems with architects in general is that they focus on the buildings and not on the humans. And that as a result, you get buildings and structures that are detached from humans. And so Gehl starts very much on the other end of that, which is let's start from the humans and then let's think about how we're going to build in response to that. How did Gehl start? Who founded it?
It's funny to notice what the photographs in architecture books look like when you have a coffee table book with architecture in it. Flip through it sometime. Most of the pictures don't have any people in them. They're about clean spaces. And this is a mindset problem. And that issue, that very mindset was what led to the founding of the practice. So the man who gave his name to the practice, Jan Gehl, who was one of the co-founders of the company with Helle Soholt, who's now our CEO, who was his student. Jan started in the 1960s and in early 70s as an architect, as a Danish architect trained in the modernist tradition that was coming out of Europe after the Second World War. There's a lot of rebuilding going on. There's a lot of public housing projects going on. You can imagine these tall blocks of stacked flats that are just racks for families. But in between the buildings, not a lot happening. So Jan is married to Ingrid. Ingrid, his wife, is a social scientist by training. And she puts him on the spot at some point and says, do you know anything about what's going on between the buildings? In fact, do you even have the tools to know what's going on between the buildings? And he's like, I don't, but why don't you teach me? So she actually teaches him social science. He then goes to Italy. She comes to Italy. He goes around the squares and piazzas of these classic, warm, beautiful Italian towns like Siena. And they start prototyping a method of measuring public life and trying to understand if you really wanted to apply social science to architecture, how would you do it in public space? Jan perfects those methods. He writes a book called Life Between Buildings. The title says it all. He comes back to Denmark and starts to preach to the architecture community, like, hey, we need to think differently about buildings. nobody wants to talk to him. Nobody wants to hear it. He actually becomes a bit of a heretic in the architecture world in Denmark. And it is his personality too. I think he likes a good debate. He likes a good fight, but he becomes kind of an outsider. And so he then continues working on this practice, though, and develops a following of students and really an international following. So a lot of mayors of cities start to read his books and fly him out to say, what would you do for our city? What should we do? And the main message is, one, measure what's happening. You've got traffic engineers with reams of data about how many cars fit in your street. If you're going to compete with that, you need equal amounts of data and argument and stories about how many people are moving or how many people could move and how many people, more importantly, can stay, can choose to inhabit a space, sort of vote with their body. And over a couple decades, Jan, with other practitioners in this field, working in different geographies, starts to transform cities, starts to pedestrianize different parts of city cores. And from that, in 2000, our practice was born. So we started a consulting practice around that. And we've grown since to about 150 people. And we work in 3 offices in New York, San Francisco, and Copenhagen.
There's some really important things in there. First of all, he may have started off working on buildings, but he very quickly, the whole practice of your company started to be about in-between places and about looking at how people use them. And it reminds me of Christopher Alexander's, who's a great architectural theorist that I talk about all the time on the show, said that ultimately it's not about the buildings, it's about the events that keep on happening there. And that it's the events that are catalyzed by the spaces that make the spaces work and make them alive. And so we're going to be talking a lot about what it means to activate spaces for humans. Before we do that, what is your role in relation to these projects?
I got to know Gehl as a practice, as a student, when I was getting my master's degree in landscape architecture at Berkeley in the early 2000s. So I'm trained as a landscape architect and worked as an urban designer for about a decade. Got to know Gehl because they were working in San Francisco. They were working on the Market Street redesign and applying these methods to Market Street. And at the time, I was leading an art collective called Rebar. We did environmental installations in cities, one of the early pioneers of what's now called tactical urbanism or guerrilla urbanism. So it's about making maybe changes to the city without permission sometimes, light, quick, cheap, but with the intention of making better public spaces, more human-oriented. And we had a shop with welders and we were building things and just working instinctively. No data collection, no method to the madness really, except just having a lot of fun and really trying to change space. So I met Gehl and realized like, hey, these guys have the science about this. These guys actually have a considered methodology for understanding if you make changes to public space, how does it change behavior? And I was like, that's exactly what we're trying to do. We're just not really measuring it. And I found out that they were opening an office in the US. They had just done Times Square, the transformation of Times Square in New York City. They were interested in expanding to the Americas. And with my partners in the collective, asked them, hey, would you open a San Francisco office? And they said, well, do you have people that would staff that office? And I said, how about we just bring over our whole team and join forces? So that was in 2014 when I stumbled into starting the US offices of Gehl. And that's what I've been doing for the last 10 years. I've built a studio here in San Francisco and brought this practice to the Americas as best we can.
What's so interesting about that story, people have to understand what tactical urban design looks like. An example of that is your group rented a parking space. So you put money in the meter, it's your parking space. And then you turned it into a little tiny park and then watched what happened. You rolled out sod and you put some chairs, and Gehl had to have some imagination to say, I think we can turn people who are doing these kinds of experiments into the kind of people that can work for a big architectural or design firm.
Looking back on it, it seems like one of the most insane and risky choices that a company could make to hire a bunch of crazy artists in San Francisco to just run the company. But I think it was an inflection point for Gehl. Gehl had just helped the Bloomberg administration pedestrianize Times Square. This is probably the biggest urban experiment in public space that has happened in a century. It was a tremendously risky endeavor, could have gone really wrong. Bloomberg was a data guy, though. And so I think collecting the data and painting the picture about how Times Square functioned really gave everyone the courage to try it. I mean, one of the key data points that came out of the study that Gehl did on Times Square was that 10% of the users, drivers, were taking up 90% of the space in Times Square. 90% of the users who were people walking had 10% of the space of Times Square. I mean, just on its face, that data is like a no-brainer. You would easily make a choice to change that. So I think that was the rise of tactical urbanism in cities, in the early 2010s. So for Gehl to join forces with Rebar, I think was actually a pretty natural step in this process of measure, test, and refine in cities. So this is our process: is we measure what's happening, we test something, we change the conditions, and then we measure again to see what happened, just like you would in any control experiment. And then you refine that and perfect the space based on what you saw. I think of it kind of like the Heisenberg uncertainty principle, right? You don't know where any particle is going until you try to measure it, but then you also change it. And so what we're trying to do is measure and change at the same time, which is really tough, but there's no other way to do it in a city. It's a live system, so you have to engage with it. And I think it's changed the practice and it's changed Gehl. And I think we have a different practice now than we did 10 years ago. It's not just Jan's method anymore of just measuring and giving advice. It's now measuring and changing and getting insight through that.
Do in-between spaces have a special function in society?
In-between spaces are everything. It is the glue that holds society together. And I actually think it's fascinating right now to see what's happening to politics and community in a world where we've pulled back from in-between spaces physically and gotten most of our human interaction online, because we're in an age of decreased empathy, decreased understanding of other people's context and frame, and often lacking the tools to have a civic or civil discourse with other people, to hear people that don't agree with us, to be able to come over to other people's way of seeing things. And honestly, a lot of the joy that comes from that, there's a lot of joy that just comes from being among others. And I think the big mistake of modernism in architecture and urban planning was this idea that everything was about program boxes. We have Euclidean zoning, we have building program, and they are these blocks of color, imagine, corresponding to retail or commercial or housing. And the boxes sit there and they just only have a relationship to each other in that they're adjacent. But there's not an understanding of actually that field in between them. But that's actually where people spend a lot of their time. And that's where society is constantly negotiating the social contract. So I just think we didn't have the tools to study it before. And if you measure something, you can believe in it as a real thing. And we now do have the tools to measure it. So it's incredibly important.
I think one thing that comes to mind when you say that, what's super interesting is we do currently have a loneliness problem, a loneliness epidemic. People are feeling more disconnected than ever, more lonelier than ever. That goes for the entire population, but that also goes for workers, modern workers, and especially also those who have more non-traditional setups of work that don't go to an office every day, but might have more flexible ways of working. And I think it's really interesting when you talked about the in-between space, which I think also is an equivalent to third spaces in third place, is that in history, third places were really the place where people connected and fostered a sense of community and connection. Those were either like physical in space, inside space places like churches, but also I think it was a lot of just public space. And I think that a lot of the work culture that has evolved since the Industrial Revolution has taken over bringing people in offices and made people spend a lot of time within spaces. And so also has at the same time taken them away from the in-between space and the outside space, the third place, right? So I wonder if and how, what the role might be in the future around companies having a responsibility to shape or to bring more attention to the in-between spaces again, or how it in general responds to work. And I know you've worked on a project that Dart visited as well that touched on that theme. So yeah, I would be really curious to hear more about that.
And let me explain what that project was. Google has created a number of visitor spaces. And so they are at the boundary between the company and the community. And they're created in part because the community says, yeah, you can build something there, but you need to actually think about how it fits into the surrounding community. And so as a part of thinking about that, they built the Google Visitor Experience. And the one I got to visit is the one in Mountain View. So let's talk about that. Blaine, you've worked on a number of projects like that one, where you're working on the boundary between a company and the community. And honestly, the traditional way of doing this, the way that we've done it for the last 30 years, is we're going to put a box in a parking lot, and then we're going to put another box in another ring of parking lot, and then we're going to put fences between them. And then there's this death zone, which is where you walk on the sidewalk on some street that's not really designed for humans. How have we arrived here where we're actually thinking about these spaces differently? And what are some of the special considerations on all of the projects that you've worked on that are right on that boundary between company and community?
So this is something I'm super fascinated by. And one of the things I do at Gehl is I work on our projects that involve this boundary between the corporate office and the community. And the other thing that I would add to your picture of the typical box in the parking lot is the lobby to shock and awe the visitor, to communicate the power of the company, or to create a blank wall with a security gate to hide what's inside the box. Either way, it's not an invitation. It's not a relationship. It's more of a boundary. And I think what companies like Google are starting to explore is this idea of a more engaged physical relationship with the community. We see this in some of the preference for downtown offices that the tech sector especially has built in large cities. A lot of that is just due to the preferences of talent, actually. People want to live in exciting places. They want to work in exciting places. They actually don't want to work in a box in a parking lot. But when you start exploring what that idea looks like, it's really interesting because it's a kind of workplace. It's an extension of workplace, but it's an extension of workplace also on the terms of the community. And it is, like Alice described, it's a third place. So the Google Visitor Experience actually contains several different third spaces, some tuned more towards community activities, some tuned more towards food and conviviality, some more about spontaneous performance and art and a looser public space. And it's a whole assemblage of these different flexible community invitations that sit right at the border of these really impressive Google buildings that are designed by Bjarke Engel's group and are really impressive architecture and a statement of workplace identity and corporate identity. So we've been working with Google for the last couple of years to conceive of how these spaces should function. And as you said, sort of in Christopher Alexander terms, what is the activity? What is the human life that those spaces can hold through their design invitations? And I really think of it as invitations. You can't make anything happen, but you can invite. So yeah, that space is quite popular. It's actually exceeded our expectations in terms of visitors, and it's Mountain View's new living room. I think that they didn't have before. And it'll be an ongoing and evolving space. It's never going to be done. It's renewed each day by the people that visit it. Sometimes Google employees, sometimes visitors, sometimes, honestly, tech tourists from out of town who come to see the magic and come to the front door.
Let me say some things I noticed about it that I thought were remarkable. One of them was, as the crow flies, it is still in the tech wasteland of Mountain View. I mean, it's not close to anything. It's in the middle of a large corporate park. In fact, it bounds on the NASA landing fields. I mean, that's what's right next to it. And so it's not a human space. And yet, the visitor experience was full of children. In fact, there's another thing I noticed, a highly configurable space, which is that at different times of the day, it has different needs. And so rather than having fixed spaces, you have a very flexible space that you've created. So we opened up one of these doors into a flexible space. It was, 44-year-olds doing art. And then we closed the door. And we didn't even know that was there until we opened the door. And like, look, there's a lot of 4-year-olds here. And then out in the lobby, there's kids standing in booths. They're not supposed to be standing, probably supposed to be sitting. But, so it's funny because I would have said ahead of time that if you build it, they will not come. And the reason I would have said that is because they're nowhere near. And yet they have. Very surprising.
I think what's so interesting about how the space functions is it's much more like an ecological space. It sort of has the logic of ecology where there's different actors acting upon each other in unexpected ways, but finding messy symbiosis. It's really the opposite of the more rational, more corporate idea of controlled space, and every square foot has a purpose and an economic function and is measured against the cost to build it. It's a little harder to say that about an ecological space, right? But at the same time, ecological spaces are tremendously valuable. They create things that the logic of linear processes and dominance can't, which is this creative space that people want to be in, a social space where things can unfold. And I think behind all these design ideas that in these experiments is maybe a pretty radical notion of what a company can be, if you really follow it. It's to say there actually is a space for unfolding, for processes to develop on their own terms, and that has value, actually. It has community value and business value, but it happens on its own time frame, and you need to create the space for it to unfold. It doesn't happen in the way we're used to understanding maybe business processes.
This is a good segue into Alice's work. So Alice, you've been working on Out of Office and the Out of Office network. A lot of what you've been doing is very much about bringing people who are distributed workers together in public places. Can you mention that work? We had you on the show before and you talked about it, but I want to give listeners context again.
Yeah, we are a network that is reimagining how we work and live in a modern world. And so it's really a lot of people who are not following the traditional 9-to-5 in-office work. And we've been hearing from our community that as much as people love working in this new form, it's also so new that it's coming with a lot of challenges. And so, as I mentioned before, social isolation, but also lack of inspiration is a big challenge that comes with sitting at home in the home office at your desk or just staring at your digital device, which is usually a very big part of remote work. And so especially this notion around social connection, so how we can foster social connection, but also how can we foster novelty has been a really big question that we've been exploring over this year. And so we've been experimenting with creating a tool, which is basically like a uniform, an out-of-office uniform, which is like a sweatshirt that invites conversations, that breaks the ice between people who are in a similar work situation and invites them to have a conversation. And on the other hand, we also have done field studies where we send people from our community into the field and then observe like a diary study where they observe how people interact in a space. What features of a space actually help people connect to each other. And so we've been starting to dream up and collectively co-create some ideas around how people could, or how spaces could also be shaped to actually help people connect more, and how we would even be able to shape some of the norms that come with our modern life, where people are very feeling like they need permission to talk to each other because we're so used to being not wanting to disturb everyone and assume everyone's busy. So we don't want to interrupt. So yeah, that's been a big part of what we've been researching and focusing on over this year.
I'd be curious, Blaine, if you are conscious about the norms that you invoke based upon the nature of the space that you create. So I can imagine if you put a spinning disco ball on the roof, the norm of dancing, which would be completely alien in other spaces, might be more normal. And so do you think about the norm layer of spaces?
I think there's two important layers to think about. One is the biological layer, which I mentioned, and where all cultures are different and geographies are different, but the human organism is all pretty similar. So we, in some ways, will respond to the same conditions about heat and cold and comfort and noise in similar ways. So those things are very unifying across humanity. And then there's the cultural layer, which is different everywhere. And there are places in the world where dancing in public space is common, and you might see it in the evening. If you go to Buenos Aires, you'll see people dancing together on street corners, which is super cool. Or if you go to Lake Merritt in Oakland on a Saturday night, you'll see people dancing to electronic music or soul, and it's super cool. But not every place is like that. And so there is this kind of software piece to public space that is both about the culture of the surrounding community and who's invited. And there's also, I think, an active curatorial layer on this too. I mean, I think sometimes about spaces need cruise directors. We need people who can come in and actually help give people permission. It won't be the design on its own that does it. Sometimes it actually is a human being, just like the host of a party, who grabs one person by the elbow and another person by the elbow and says, "You two are really interesting people. Why don't you talk about this?" And they take it from there. So I think there's all those layers. And it is really, again, about invitations and experimentation. I think you sometimes don't really know what the cultural attitudes are until you try something, and then you find out, and then sometimes you change it in the process. One of the experiments in the Google Visitor experience, I think we pointed this out when we were walking by, is that we sort of under-provisioned the electrical outlets in some of the group tables so that people would have just a little more interaction with each other when they wanted to plug in their laptop, because we were just trying to tune the space a little bit less to be an isolated, like, work for 4 hours type of space. It's an invitation to talk. It might be a slightly annoying invitation, but it's there, and we're seeing how it works. I've seen people actually have a conversation about sharing the plug.
I've actually leveraged that, not there, but at another cafe that I go to, there's very few plugs, so I bring an extension cord with multiple outlets. And that gives me the opportunity to be generous with my cord, and then I start to know the people by me.
It's a gift. Yeah, it's an offering.
It is. It is. I think I need to try this experiment at work, which is I need to take a table in the lunchroom and I need to put a sign on it that says, "At this table, strangers talk to strangers." And see who comes, who's going to sit with me, because otherwise it's rude.
Yeah, we've really seen people needing permission to talk to each other. Some things we've been experimenting with is even having on tables, we've hosted different co-working events where we had chatty tables and heads down tables. So people know in which mode of work they are, they can sit depending on what they need. And so chatty tables provide that invitation. Another thing where, for instance, a lot of people mentioned on a survey that we ran were laptop stickers, because if it's from a common band or a festival that someone went to, or you find that there's some form of something you have in common. And so there's something you can connect over. So these elements that really provide either identity or just a moment to break the ice, an icebreaker in that sense.
We talk about those as third things or triangulation. We've done some studies of what types of third thing lead to different interactions in public space. We did one study in San Jose of people's favorite spaces, and the top third thing was pets. Next was children. And the next was being stuck next to somebody in line. So that's actually an interesting one too. The sort of unplanned adjacency that you can't quite get out of for a little while, where natural manners kick in and people kind of ask each other about something like the weather. But it's almost like standing in line is the permission. If you're there, you're almost saying, I'm here to be interacted with. Because people need that. They don't do it on their own, where we need a little kickstart.
I happen to be in New Orleans at the moment, and in New Orleans, people do it on their own. I already have noticed it, that it's a much more social city than anything I've lived in before. But what we're coming across, I think we're having different words for this. Okay, so there's third things that you described. You used the word invitations, which is that you extend invitations for people to come into a space and to engage in a space. And Alice, you said people need permission. And somebody I had on the show some time ago, Klaus Rasted, who is one of the people who runs the College of Extraordinary Experiences, he describes giving people an alibi to do something they would never otherwise do. And so he's taking people across much larger social thresholds into things that you would never do outside of the College of Extraordinary Experiences. But this idea that we can introduce enzymes, catalysts that bring people together is really important. And I think one of the things that you spoke about earlier is that public spaces and in-between spaces are where we develop empathy. I think corporations have a real stake in creating empathy in their community for the members of the company.
That's right. I mean, I think, let's be real here. Why would a company invest in third spaces? I think a good reason actually is both to understand the community better, right? You're going to design better products. You're going to be a better company with a market offering if you are closer to the people that you're designing for. That's definitely true. And we've seen in the spaces that we've helped companies with, because we measure it, that community perception of the company improves when there's active third spaces and public realm at the threshold of community and company. Because number one, there's better understanding of what that company is about because they are leading with their values. They're not just talking about it, they're actually showing what they mean. And also because there's an imageable brand that's happening all the time through that space. It's not just a graphic or a slogan, it is a lived, felt experience, which I think is just tremendously powerful. I would buy that if I were a company over a great slogan or a great URL. So I think there's good self-interested reasons for companies to do this too. But again, I think long-term, we want a permaculture of companies, I think. We want a culture of companies that are really built to last. And I just don't think that we can have that without companies being integrated into the communities that really they're a part of.
What are some of the other projects that you've worked on? We've talked about some of them, but there's a list of others, and I can mention a few of them. First of all, there's been Google, and Google's USA, UK, EU. There's been a couple of different places. There's what looks like Basin 7 Waterfront Master Plan. That's in Denmark. There's the 3rd Street Promenade Concept Design. That's Santa Monica. There's Built to Play Impact Assessment. What do these share in common, and what are some of their differences?
All of our projects start with this idea of measuring and understanding public life, what we call public life, what happens in between buildings, and using that to drive design strategy. And really working with our clients to build capacity to keep doing that, to keep understanding that space is a constantly unfolding invitation that will change over time. Unlike the architecture books, it's not done as a static image. It is a space that we have to keep reinventing every day. And I think there's a different discipline and a different habit of practice to do that over the long haul. I want to talk about a totally different project, which is the Stanford Door School for Sustainability, which is one we just wrapped up. But I think it touches on a lot of these issues that we're talking about. So Stanford started a new school. I think it's the first school in 70 years that the university has founded. And it's around this idea of solving climate change making a world where human and non-human nature can thrive in perpetuity together. And we stepped in to help Stanford develop the vision for what this school would look like. What does a school that solves climate change have to look like? What kinds of spaces do you need for a project like that? And I think one of the first things that we asked was, okay, we need to break down silos. We need to get people collaborating that have never collaborated before. We need to get a robotics engineer collaborating with an oceanographer. Where have they done that before? What invitations have actually sparked that kind of unlikely adjacency and those cross-disciplinary silo-busting moments? And fortunately, Stanford has that in abundance. They actually have a lot of really great collaborations. So we went and did ethnography on those interactions. We looked at those joint collaboration labs. We looked at how those folks had lunch together. When the principal investigators, how did they meet? Where were they? What was that space like? And we reverse engineered a vision for the spaces of the school from that study. And the thesis that came out of it was that innovation runs on a social operating system. It runs on this operating system that, just like we talked about, of this kind of invitation, alibi, excuse, reason to speak to somebody who you weren't expecting, because that's the collaboration that you need. It's the one you didn't know you needed. And we developed a whole language, a pattern language, if you will, to put it in Christopher Alexander terms, of spaces for the school that we thought would support that in different ways. And so that school is being designed right now. They've hired a tremendous architect, Studio Gang, to do the design for construction. And it really was a lot of fun, because I think it's fun to think about how innovation works spatially. And that's what we did on that project.
You used a phrase in that particular project that I really like, which is radical adjacencies, which is how do you bring people together from very distant disciplines and get them to engage with each other? And then you used another phrase, which was orgware. So there's hardware. When do you use hardware? And when do you use orgware? What's an example of orgware?
Orgware, this is this idea of the cruise director, right? Which is, we actually picked up on this by looking at Stanford's D School, which your listeners might be familiar with. It's a really great space where there's a lot of flexible spaces that are designed around collaboration and messiness. You can move the tables and chairs around. You can draw on the walls. You can start making a cardboard model. Well, guess what? It actually can't just be messy. It can't just be there are no rules and anyone can move a chair anywhere, because that quickly turns into a space that nobody wants to be in and nobody will collaborate. But the orgware is the sign on the wall, maybe just a 8.5 by 11 sheet of paper that says, please move the tables. And after you move them, but before you leave the room, put them back into this configuration. It looks like this. It's giving just a little bit of structure, a little bit of manners, so that you can have a culture that supports the design. If you just have design without culture, it doesn't work. It's the design of the human system that fits around the design that keeps bringing the life patterns that you want. Another example is the D School literally has a cruise director. That's not her title, but she's in charge of doing that thing where you take one person by the arm and lead them up to another person and say, hey, let's have a conversation here, or making sure that events happen and include the right people. There needs to be somebody whose job it is to look after that orgware. It's not something that you can set and forget.
Alice, are you coming across the same needs for orgware?
Yeah, definitely. I feel it is this, and I think this is applicable in a lot of different areas. There is this, order to do great work as well, you need space and you need time to explore and ponder and explore different things. But then you do also need some form of container. We've seen this a lot with artists, for instance, as well. There needs to be some form of Canva or some form of medium in order to have some sort of structure. Otherwise, it's just too messy and too open and too unclear where to even start. So yeah, I think it applies in a lot of different areas. And coming back to interactions within spaces, I think it's definitely also going back to the permission elements and to the invitation. For instance, the merch or this table sign. People can't be completely left on their own. And it's interesting, actually, what you said as well makes me even think about community design and workplace culture as well, right? It needs some form of leadership or some form of direction and some sort of guidance or principles of what a space, a community, a team is about. And so it feels like a really common theme across so many different areas.
On the Stanford project, it just reminded me of some of the funny things we saw. We just spent days photographing break rooms and looking at offices, trying to understand what was happening in the culture based on sort of the artifacts we would see out. One thing we noticed was on every floor of one of the academic buildings, there was a display case, like bookshelves. We understood that it was designed to hold displays and exhibits of the different departments' academic work. And some of them were full of stuff, cool stuff. There was models and experiments and poster boards and whatnot. And some of them were just empty. And we couldn't find a difference in the departments, really. The empty ones would have material in other places, but what we found was that actually it was the ones that were full had a staff person whose desk was nearby. And just the cue to care about the space because there was someone nearby helped people populate the display. And where there was no one around, nobody felt like the space mattered or was valuable. And so no one ventured to put anything there. It's just kind of this interesting thing that it's like hard to predict that behavior. But once you see it, it gives you a little clue maybe about, hey, maybe in the future building, we actually need to make sure that there's no public space that is too far away from a human being who's there all the time and it's going to be a friendly face.
When I was in my 20s, I got to be a residential fellow at the Carl Gerasi Foundation, which is for artists. And in retrospect, I realized it was very consciously designed to do these sorts of things. So first of all, it was artists from every medium. So during the day, everybody would break up into their spaces. The writers would go to their little boxes, and the dancers would go to a dance studio, and the sculptors would go to a sculpture studio. But every day, we had dinner, and there was a cruise coordinator who was essentially a chef who would, because of the timing of dinner, everybody had to come together at that time. Otherwise, we were free. It was so powerful to meet with an international, very, very international, very different art forms, and everybody being thrown together for a little while. It's not like everybody liked each other all the time, but it was super productive intellectually.
Yeah, Carol Coletta, who heads up the Memphis Riverfront organization and is a big booster of Memphis, Tennessee, and she used to be at the Knight Foundation. We've done a lot of work with Carol over the years. She explained to me at one point that good public space, it's like ballroom dancing. It doesn't happen unless you know the rules to interact. And it may seem a little old-fashioned, but actually having people who know how to dance together lets there be a dance. There's a value to structure. It lets, as Al said, it lets people be creative. It lets people play.
Yes, a value to structure. I think in retrospect that one of the problems with dinners at the Gerasi Foundation was that everybody was sort of an alpha artist. And so nobody was willing to be led in the dance. It was funny. It was funny. At that level, people are very, very competitive, I think.
It makes you want to design a parlor game for those people. Make those alphas into the temporary sub.
Yeah. Yeah. It's funny to think of it that way, but it's really true. The alpha artists.
I'm super curious about the serendipity dwelling part, if you can more actively design for these things as well, or if it's really mostly about just giving the space, having some form of leader, guidance, composer around it, or if there's something that even companies should consider for creating more of that, or if there's anything else to that topic.
You had this wonderful phrase another time we talked, Alice. It was the surface area for serendipity. which I really like, just increasing that surface area for serendipity. I think that should be really important to companies. Any company who's concerned with creativity, concerned with problem solving, and there's different spaces, I think, that support more linear, heads down work versus collaborative and emergent work, and then also getting unstuck. And I've been really interested in the concept of attention. There's a great Ezra Klein podcast from a few weeks ago on attention, if you want to look for it. And just the way that actually attention has been commodified and monetized. And in the workplace, it's obsessed over this idea that we have to keep people's attention focused on their work. But there's different kinds of attention. And there's the attention of hammering one thing and then driving towards action. And then there's the attention of being open and letting the surroundings emerge to tell you what to do next. And I think we're pretty good at the first kind of attention, at saying, pay attention and do this task. We're not that good, and our workplaces aren't designed super well for the unfolding attention, to attend to something. And I think there's just this huge opportunity, right, for the workplace to actually build spaces of open attention. Because how many times have you been just stuck with a white page trying to come up with that next sentence, and then you go take a walk and see a hummingbird, and you're like, oh, okay, fine. And then you come back and you just break through. You can spend hours hitting your head against the wall or have 10 minutes of the right kind of attention. And it's a much more efficient way to keep the work moving. So I think we're just kind of at the beginning of those sorts of spaces. We've been stuck in a mindset of ping pong tables and fountains as like that's the kind of attention space we need. But I think there's something about this more open-ended, contemplative, but actually very creatively and work-focused, potentially, spaces that could be really important to the workplace.
It reminds me of something I was going to mention earlier, which is that we were talking to a grandmother in Mexico, and she was talking about why they were fighting electrification of their town. And the reason was you electrify a town, and then people get off their front porches and they go and watch TV. There's a way in which what has been created is an attention grabber away from other people. So that's one thing about those in-between spaces, is that they are competing with the interior spaces, or vice versa. The interior spaces are competing. But this idea that different kinds of attention should be considered like a portfolio that should be balanced. That's not something that we talk about.
Yeah, just to add to that, I think it's taking away attention from each other, but it also takes away attention from your own thoughts, from your own awareness, and from your own intuition, and from your own ideas. So it's both things, right?
I'll just give one more example of our work with Google. Google has made a commitment to ecological and habitat spaces around its campuses, which is quite interesting, and really want to acknowledge the Google ecology team. It's a group of folks who think about and know a lot about how ecology works and are trying to integrate things like pollinator spaces and bird habitat and wildlife habitat into corporate landscapes. So one of the things we're working on right now is we're using the Gehl methodology of studying human behavior and studying animal and plant behavior in the same spaces and trying to understand how they interact. And we're literally in the middle of a study right now across Google's campuses. So I'm going to be so fascinated to see how that turns out, because I'm personally really curious to ask questions like, when you're stuck, what species unsticks you, actually? What type of interaction with nature helps you have a hard conversation with a colleague? We are just at the beginning of that technology, I think, in the global north. But why not partner with nature as a real active partner in human work? We've been doing it for thousands of years. There's no reason that we can't actually have those kinds of symbiotic relationships with the natural environment in our public spaces in a workplace context too. And hey, it might actually help us as a society have some breakthroughs that we're struggling with.
I noticed that when I was walking around the campus with you and your colleagues, is that your attention to the environment was much more expansive than my own. So, for instance, between two different buildings where one would expect visitors to walk from one building to the next building, you cared a lot about that there was something that would draw people's attention to the next part of the walk. So there were sculptures and things like that. But then you noticed a dead zone. You noticed a place where there was nothing happening. And so what I saw in action was a way of looking at the world, which was not looking at my feet the way I would tend to walk, but looking at what's the experience that I'm walking through. And so now you've just expanded that into what's the natural environment, what's the plant and animal environment that I'm walking through, not just the architectural environment. What strikes me is that it's hard to know how to act. A part of the way that we decide how to act is by picking up a lens that's going to reduce the number of dimensions that we have to act within. And so I understand why people focus on building, because it's a lot to focus on, and it might be more than we can handle in the first place. And so it does strike me as a decision space to work in.
Sometimes if you watch me in public space, you'll just see me staring at other people, which hopefully doesn't seem too creepy, but it's a way of trying to understand through the lens of other people how the space is shaping behavior. It's oftentimes just by looking at the phenomena in front of us and the behavior in front of us that we start to understand. We create a mental model of behavior and understand what's happening. I was going to add that I think data here is important to this issue of the lens. If it's just my story or my intuition about the space, that's real, but it's a little hard to base decisions around. And it's also, you come up against other data sets, and data always ends up winning out. So I think one of the things we're trying to do with this lens is to measure, to actually have quantifiable information about these ineffable experiences, and then to build a couple insights around that so that we can point to just exactly what's happening here. How big is the phenomenon? What are we seeing? I have found that example with Times Square, it can come down to just one data point often. You might gather hundreds of megabytes of data, but it's only one statistic that matters in the end, but it ends up confirming our intuition about what it means to be human. And then everyone can move on to the right move.
You're also doing something that I think is really important, which is that we talk about experience all the time. And we've said the word experience a lot in this conversation and in past episodes, because I talked to a lot of experienced designers. But ultimately, you anchor on behavior. How are people responding? I don't actually have to know what their experience is. How they're responding is probably a result of their experience, but it's much more observable.
That's right. I think there's a place for measuring experience too, but of course, we know that measuring experience is always going to be a subjective exercise. We rely on the reporting of people's experiences. There's no other way to really get an experience except through the filter of our brains and language to get that experience out of one person's subjective being and into another's. We have developed some interesting tools, though, that are getting at that. We use a thing we call a photo voice app, which takes people on guided journeys and then prompts them to take photographs at certain moments. If you know the app Be Real, it's kind of like that, except for your urban experience. And then we use artificial intelligence to analyze the kinds of images they take to understand the structure of them and what they're of, and then also analyze the tagging that the user does of those experiences. So they're a little more subjective tagging. And then we'll build a model of what their experience is based on those inputs. It's a little different than asking someone how they feel, though. And I think that is a tool that architects are used to using quite a bit, is to say, do you like this or not? And it turns out that actually whether you like something or not is not maybe the best tool to use. You actually want to find out what someone is experiencing in that moment, not later on when they report back on it. So we've been using that tool quite a bit, and I think found some interesting insights, like certain cultural groups react negatively to unexpected but not totally surprising architecture that invokes things like histories of oppression. And you wouldn't maybe get that unless you had a way of tapping into that person's experience in the moment that they see it. And you start to see a pattern like, hey, these folks didn't like seeing colonial columns, for instance, which is actually something that we saw.
You might want to explore the work of Paul Zak. He's somebody who came on the show, and he's created the capability to measure oxytocin real time. And what he's found is that self-reporting is completely inaccurate, but measurements of oxytocin are highly predictive of behavior.
That's fascinating. I will check it out. Paul Zak.
Z-A-K, yeah. He wrote a book called Immersion, and he was on, 5-10 episodes ago, so he's a fairly recent guest. Alice, I've already asked you this question. I'm going to start doing the closing questions, but I haven't asked Blaine this question, which is, Blaine, what job do you hire your job to do for you?
Such a great question. I have been really lucky, I think, to have a career so far of being a deep generalist all the time. I get to explore a lot of different issues about being human and living this life. And I think about that all the time. I would think about it whether I was paid to do it or not. When I was a kid, I wanted to be a reporter, like a newspaper reporter. I wanted to understand how the world worked and to help other people understand it. I'm not a reporter, but I do a lot of observation, and I do actually a lot of reporting of how people live. That's really what I've optimized my work life for, is getting to think about that a lot and spend time constantly being a student of what's going on in the world, and sometimes finding a way to have those observations be valuable to others and helping them.
There's an interesting thing in there, which I haven't heard very often. Some of it, I assume, goes to puzzle solving, which is, okay, now how do I make this better? But some of it is just the joy of plain seeing. There was a philosopher, which I've never, ever been able to find this quote again, who said that humans take joy in using the faculties that they were given. No, it was more specific. Nature has equipped humans with joy of using the faculties that they were given. And so we were given eyes, and so we love to see things. And we were given taste, we love to taste things. We have hands, so we love to make things. And that having hands without the love of the making wouldn't result in the right outcome. But the way you just stated is one of the rawest forms I've heard it said, which is, I like to study what's happening. I like to see it and observe it.
If you're an urbanist, if you're somebody who sort of thinks about cities, it's kind of depressing often, right? You look around and you see a lot of ideas that were thought up a generation ago continuing to punish the inhabitants of cities today. And so there's a sense of injustice a little bit, or maybe something's not quite right with the world. And for me, just to be raw about it, it's almost therapy. It's a way of working that out, where I feel like by actually understanding people and validating behavior, validating human nature, our biological bodies, who we really are as a species, and saying, we're not the problem. We don't need to actually change the human body to fit last century's planning ideas. We need to observe and see really clearly who we are as people. And that is okay. We are great. And by articulating that, I feel like is the only hope of having our habitat match who we really are. So I feel like I work through that feeling of things not being right by trying to see really what's going on so that hopefully we can all see it more clearly.
And maybe you've just said some of it, but what does your work cost you?
You mentioned making things with your hands. I think there's a danger in this of being too, in any design and planning and strategy work, of going up too high in the helicopter. And also it's knowledge work, and that puts you into a reality of being on your device a lot. And I've found in my career a lot of truth and inspiration just by making things and doing things. And to be totally honest, I've gotten further away from that as I progressed in my career, because I'm not the best, fastest person at making things. So for me, the cost of going up in the helicopter is losing that relationship with my hands and my making side.
Do you miss touching soil? I say that, do you miss touching dirt, which is that You started off in landscape, and I don't know if you were touching dirt at the time, but planting a plant.
Here's the thing is landscape architects don't usually touch a lot of
They
dirt
don't
either.
touch a lot of dirt.
They mostly touch a lot of a mouse and keyboard, but
yeah. Okay.
We find other ways, right, in our lives to do these things. And I build a lot of things on my off time, and I am like insatiably project oriented, and I do a lot of gardening and stuff too. So I wish there was a career that could marry those two together all the way through your career. I find that there's a branch sometimes earlier in your career where the two diverge. It's a little hard to keep them together.
Let me know once you find it.
All work, like all products, contain design trade-offs. You just can't get all the features in the product of work, just like you can't get all the features you might want in the product of car or anything else. And so one of the things I think is really important that's been a part of my work is to find out that if you feel like you're not getting everything out of your work that you think you should, that's because it's impossible to get everything.
My wife is the trade-off person. She always is like, there's a trade-off. And I'm like, at both sides, you got to optimize. We're constantly like, no, I can, it's, yeah.
But that's also why a lot of people create more of a portfolio career. So it's actually a lot of different things. And so you mix all these different parts and get different activities, experiences in different parts of your life / even career.
One thing I'll say too, back to this idea of ecology and open spaces of attention, is one thing that we often do at Gehl when we're working, we do a lot of work with city leaders and the mayor and the head of the transportation department. And instead of doing a kickoff meeting inside of a meeting room in the city offices, we'll rent bikes for everybody and we'll say, okay, we're talking about the city. We're talking about maybe the bike infrastructure of the city. Let's actually open this conversation by biking together. Let's do something together physically with our bodies. And let's actually have the workshop on foot. We call it a walk shop. It's a reframe of the haptic and sensory experience of what we're doing. And it really does change how people think, I believe. And maybe this isn't the same as getting dirt under your fingernails all the time, but I mean, this idea of having a strategic conversation about urban development while you're gardening or while you're biking, I think leads to different outcomes because it uses different parts of our brains. And it actually starts to change some of our set responses around territory defense and maybe some of the things where we got to come in trying to bargain for in those conversations. So I like this idea of maybe trying to mash up some of these high and low strategy and body experiences.
Where can people learn more about Gehl and about you?
The Gehl website is gehlpeople.com, Gehl people.com. We have an issue page. If you search on Gehl Architects on issue to use, I think, you actually can see a lot of our work. We try to be pretty open source about our work, and you can see the way we do our analysis and the kinds of data collection and experiments we've done in cities. All of our methods are open source, actually, around public life. So if you buy any of the books with Jan Gehl's name in them, there's one called How to Measure Public Life that's kind of a great primer. You can do this yourself. And I'm out there online. I've got a uniquely spelled name. So if you search on me and search on videos, you can see me talking about these ideas in various places.
And is the Rebar site still up, the group that you were a member of?
So the Rebar site is not up, but one thing that we have kept alive, thanks to my Rebar co-founder, John Bella, his good work, is the Parking Day website. So this experiment in the appropriation of the meter parking space as public parks still happens every Friday in September. It is Worldwide Parking Day, where anybody can make a public park themselves in a parking space. There's resources there at myparkingday.org. I believe it's all one word, myparkingday.org. And you can learn about the project. And the Rebar history is actually pretty well documented in a few books. And Henry Graeber's new book on parking and in various Wikipedia articles.
One of the links I know we'll have that goes out with the show is one which is Rebar's Absurd Tactics in Generous Urbanism. And I can't remember if that's a video or if it's an article, but It was one of the things I read leading up to this, and it was really good. Thank you both for coming on the show. Thank you, Alice, for introducing me to Gehl in general.
My pleasure.
And thanks very much, Blaine, for coming on the show.
Super fun to talk to you both. I really enjoyed it. Thanks.
Thanks for joining me for another episode of Work for Humans. If you enjoyed this episode, please give us a 5-star rating wherever you listen to podcasts. And share the show with one person you think would get value from it. Believe it or not, this really helps us grow the show and reach more people who want to build the kind of work that people really want. As always, thank you to my producer, Jason Ames at Ninth Path Audio for his insights into content and his high standard for quality. Final note, the opinions shared here are my own and not the views of Google or Cisco Systems. Thanks again for listening. See you next time.